For this lesson, we're going to look at the Texas executive branch. Now, there are a number of models that can be used for executive organization. The model that's frequently used in the northeastern part of the United States and at the national level is called the integrated or centralized model, in which the governor is elected by the voters and then appoints the heads of the departments or the associate heads of the departments, and he basically has responsibility for the personnel, the budget, and the policy. A second model is the unintegrated model. In this model, the voters select the heads of the departments, and each of the department heads controls personnel, budget, and policy. The governor has very little direct control over what takes place in anything other than the governor's office. Now, complicating this is a second model of unintegrated position, in which a board or commission is either appointed by the governor or elected by the voters, and it is the board that has the responsibility for personnel, budget, and policy. When we look at the overall functions of the executive branch, the first thing is to administer the laws passed by the legislature. And increasingly, the legislature has given responsibility to elaborate on those laws to the executive branch, to make policies, to make regulations. This is frequently done with a great number of stipulations as to how it can be done and when it can be done. Political leadership to initiate policy. Then there's the clemency function, pardons, reprieves, paroles, and commutations. We'll talk about the governor's role in that later. And then, of course, the symbolic and ceremonial. Now, the governor of Texas has to be 30 years of age, a U.S. citizen, a resident of the state for 5 years. We compensate them now at the value of $153,750, plus housing, the governor's mansion, and transportation. Basically, the powers of the governor can be classified into three main categories: legislative, judicial, and executive. It is in the legislative area where the governor of Texas has his strongest powers. He has an item veto, but this is true of all other 49 other governors. He can call special sessions, and there's no limit on the number of special sessions that the governor can call. Each special session is limited to a maximum of 30 days, but does not have to go that long. He has a constitutional right to address the legislature. In fact, is the only person who can address the legislature in joint session or in single chamber without having been invited. He can declare legislative emergencies. And when we get to the, as I pointed out when we did the legislature, that has limited value. Then, in the clemency area, the governor of Texas, like many governors, is very limited. There is a board of pardons and paroles, and I'll not go into how the board of pardons and paroles is created. With one exception, any clemency issued by the governor has to have been recommended by the board of pardons and paroles. He has absolutely no authority over paroles. That took place back in the 1980s when Mark White was governor, and there were a number of reasons, some political, some just in terms of staff time, that led Mark White to say, I want out of this process. Then there is the executive responsibility to appoint and remove the heads of departments, which the governor has some, but not much, to recommend a budget, but not much, as we shall see, with being able to supervise the overall spending of the budget, some limited directory and supervisory responsibility, and then military and law enforcement responsibility. In the appointment area, the governor can appoint people to positions that are provided for by the legislature. There are some that he has no control over. Now, there's some very real limits on the governor's appointment power. Staggered terms. Most of the people serve 6-year terms, so that only 1/3 come up for appointment every 2 years. A tradition of the Senate, called senatorial courtesy, in which the home senator of a proposed appointee has absolute right to veto that appointment. The Senate will not even consider the nomination of anyone if the senator exercises senatorial courtesy. It takes 2/3 of the Senate to approve an appointee. Now, the fact that most of the positions are non-salaried limits who can afford to be on most of these boards and commissions. And then interest groups play a very significant role. If it is a regulatory agency which deals with a specific profession or specific business, you can bet that the interest groups representing that group or that particular interest will have a say in who gets appointed. The governor has very limited removal power in Texas. He or she can only remove people that they personally appointed, provided that 2/3 of the Senate agrees. Now, in reality, since that provision was adopted, not a single person has ever been removed by the governor using this particular authority. Now, the governor's executive powers include proposing a budget, but as we shall see when we get to the next unit, the governor's budget recommendations don't carry a lot of weight, an item veto over any item in the appropriations bill, and very, very limited budget execution authority. Now, what that means is being able to transfer money from one part of the budget to another part of the budget. In Texas, that can only happen if the Legislative Budget Board agrees to that having been done. He also can appoint the Adjutant General, who heads up the Texas National Guard, but there's kind of a hitch here. He cannot appoint anyone that has not been put on the appointment list by the U.S. Department of Defense. He can order the mobilization of the National Guard for national disasters or for peacekeeping purposes. In the area of law enforcement, he appoints the Public Safety Board, which administers the Texas Department of Public Safety, and can direct the Texas Rangers to take action if they so desire. But of course, there are only a handful, less than 200 Texas Rangers for the entire state of Texas, so that really isn't a huge force. He appoints the Board of Pardons and Paroles. His only unlimited execution judicial power is to grant one 30-day stay of execution for a person who happens to be up for execution. And I've got a kind of a sick joke about that. The warden comes in and tells a fellow on death row scheduled to be executed that night, I've got good news, and maybe some not so good news. What's the good news? You have been granted a stay of execution. You will not be executed tonight. You will have 30 days. Okay, what's the bad news? Well, the Court of Criminal Appeals and the Board of Pardons and Paroles have both turned down your appeal for review of the case. Pardons can be either full or conditional, and commutations of sentences, which are essentially a reduction in the sentence, also require Board of Pardons and Paroles approval. Now, right now, the governor has about 137 people on his staff, but most of those are funded by federal grants for purposes that are spelled out in the grants, such as criminal justice, emergency management, etc. In addition to the governor, there are some offices that are constitutionally established and some that have been established by the legislature. The 5 officials elected statewide who head up the departments of their own are the governor, the lieutenant governor. Of course, the lieutenant governor has no executive authority except when the governor is out of the state or dies, resigns, and he then becomes the governor. The Attorney General, the Comptroller of Public Accounts, and the Commissioner of the General Land Office. We'll look at each one of those. There's also a statutory agency, the Texas Department of Agriculture, headed by a Commissioner of Agriculture who is elected at the same time as the other officers. Now, the Attorney General of Texas is the state's chief legal officer in civil cases only. No criminal jurisdiction, period. He represents the state in legal actions both as a plaintiff and as a defendant. He has limited power to enforce the state's antitrust and consumer protection laws, and probably most importantly, has the authority to issue opinions on legal questions presented to his office. Now, not everybody can ask the Attorney General for an opinion. In fact, there's a very limited number of individuals and officers who are allowed to do so. The book goes into that if you're interested. Now, two functions that the Attorney Generals would love to get rid of are collecting child support when the counties have been unable to do so. It's kind of a loser proposition. If the counties can't do it, probably the Attorney General can't either. And administering the Victims of Crime Assistance Grants, which would be nice if the legislature put any money in the account. The Comptroller's Office collects taxes for the state, makes budget estimates, and we'll explain how important those budget estimates are when we get down to the budget process, is custodian of most state funds. And I could take off on a very lengthy discussion of how some funds are considered agency funds and are handled at the agency level, and other funds are handled as state funds by the comptroller. I think it's probably best that we not go into that. And if it's a bill that the state is supposed to pay and not a specific agency, then the Comptroller's Office is responsible for that. The State Land Commissioner supervises all state-owned lands, administers the Veterans Land Fund, and prepares and administers a coastal zone management plan required by the federal government of all coastal counties, of all coastal states on the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic, or Pacific. Now, the statutory agency of the Department of Agriculture was established primarily in response to the protest by the farmers that they were being shafted by the grain elevator operators and the people who bought and measured their stuff. So the Department of Agriculture implements all laws regulating the agricultural section of the economy not covered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Folks, that is such a small percentage, it's almost not worth talking about. It is the consumer protection area, weights and measures in particular, that takes up the biggest chunk of the time of the Commissioner of Agriculture. And then there are various marketing programs to help push Texas agricultural products. Now, the same reform movement of the late 19th and early 20th century led to the creation of the Texas Railroad Commission. It's a constitutionally established board of 3 members elected by the voters. And the key thing is it's basically misnamed. It has little or no real railroad transportation regulation responsibility. Its major job now, and has been since the discovery of oil in Texas, is the regulation of mining and extractive industries. At one time, they had a major responsibility for licensing and intrastate road transportation, but the definition of what constitutes interstate road transportation has grown to such a point that it's mostly federal now and not state. But very, very important is the regulation of pipelines. Texas has more miles of pipeline than any other state, and almost as many miles as the nation as a whole. Now, the State Board of Education is also elected. It's a 15-member board elected from districts. They have limited responsibility over the Texas public education system. Now, let me digress for a second. They can recommend to the governor the appointment of a commissioner of education. However, under George W. Bush, Governor Bush said you can name anybody you want to, but if their name isn't, and he gave them a name, I'm not going to appoint them. They manage the investments of the Permanent School Fund and oversee the Texas public education system consistent with the provisions of the Texas Education Code. One of those powers is the ability to approve textbooks that will be paid for by the state when they're used by the schools. And you may be somewhat familiar with the flap that arose a year or so ago when a former member of the State Board of Education wrote a book on Mexican American politics in Texas that was not terribly complimentary of Mexican Americans as a whole and inaccurate in many ways. The board, however, considered it and after tremendous pressure from academics and the Latino groups, rejected it. So let's look. The governor can appoint a Secretary of State, an Adjutant General, and then you have 4 offices that the governor has major influence over the appointment of the officials who head up the department. When Ann Richards was governor, became governor, there was a major consideration of the problems the State Board of Insurance had created. 2 of the 3 members of the State Board of Insurance represented insurance companies, and needless to say, they were not terribly sympathetic to the plight of consumers. So Ann Richards asked the legislature to give her the sole authority to appoint the director or commissioner of insurance. The same thing is true some years later under George Bush's administration with the Department of Health. There were 12 different agencies that dealt with some aspect of health, each of which was headed up or controlled by a multi-member board. So what they did was they replaced these 12 agencies, or consolidated them into one agency, and gave the governor the power to appoint the director of the Texas Department of Health. Now, with Housing and Community Affairs and the Commissioner of Education, you got a slightly different situation. Each of the boards can recommend to the governor who will be appointed, but the governor doesn't necessarily have to take their recommendation. And George Bush, with regard to education, made it very clear to the State Board of Education that they could suggest anybody they wanted to, but unless their name was, and he gave them a specific name, that person would not be appointed. As in Texas, as in all 49 other states, the Secretary of State is the chief election official of the state, handles charters for corporations, and processes extradition requests. We have 2 elected boards, Railroad Commission, State Board of Education. Notable difference between them, number of members and the amount of pay. The Railroad Commission is paid a salary. Each railroad commissioner is paid a salary. But the members of the State Board of Education are not.